When asking someone from Oregon about Rajneeshpuram, they will usually either answer with confusion or discomfort. Many of them will recall watching the situation deteriorate on the news while remarking about how weird or surreal it was, but the details are often lost, with only a few surviving in memory, such as its Indian guru leader and a woman named Sheila. A cursory glance reveals that the group was responsible for the second largest bioterrorist attack in American history, only eclipsed by the infamous smallpox blankets, and yet, to many, their name remains unknown or obscure. So what was Rajneeshpuram, and how did it gain its reputation? Over the course of the 1960s, a professor of philosophy named Chandra Mohan Jain had been increasing his presence in India. He had obtained his professorship at the University of Jabalpur in 1960, but he was better known for his frequent travels across India under his nickname, Rajneesh, where he would proclaim the benefits of a life filled with pleasure and celebration. He made a name for himself as a dissident, openly attacking Mahatma Gandhi and spreading controversial ideas such as capitalism and birth control. While most of Indian society seemed to perceive him as a deviant, his charisma and popularity saw that he was still routinely invited to conferences. By 1964, he was holding meditation camps where wealthy resort-goers could practice his unique methods, largely informed by the New Age movement. Eventually, in 1966, he was asked by his college to step down, but by this point he was making so much money from his meditation camps and his speeches that this was of little consequence to him. In 1970, with the help of one of his followers, Jain settled down into an apartment in Bombay where people would go to see him. From here, he focused all of his efforts into building what became known as the Rajneesh movement, based around his teachings. He named his followers neo-sannyasins, placing them in direct opposition to the typical Hindi sannyasin monks while still requiring them to wear the traditional red or orange clothing, as well as the wooden beads. Rajneesh, however, added one part to the garb. The prayer beads would also have a portrait of his face hanging from it. He would give his followers new names. The men would be given the prefix Swami, the women Ma. Rather than displaying asceticism, his followers would be taught to revel and indulge, with sex being observed as something holy and divine. Soon after, in 1972, he would give himself a new name, Bhagwan Sri Rajneesh, Bhagwan meaning Blessed One, Lord, or God, which marked him as a guru. He developed a new method of meditation, which he named dynamic meditation, which involved a great deal of rhythmic movement, screaming, and hyperventilation, followed by a complete stillness. Meanwhile, in America, a strong anti-establishment movement had been growing. New psychologists and spiritual enthusiasts were looking for understandings of consciousness and the mind that existed outside of an intellectualist paradigm. They would often travel to India to speak with gurus, and among them, the Rajneesh movement stood out. Rajneesh demanded no precise learning, and he spoke fluent English, making his teachings easy to adopt, and so many of these psychologists and interested bodies became adherents to his new religious movement. After receiving training from Rajneesh, these people would be sent back to America to turn their psychiatric practices into franchised meditation centers, with much of the money raised from them sent back to Rajneesh. Due to a connection, a considerable portion of the people who went to see him were psychologists from California, where a large demographic were wealthy and had embraced New Age philosophies and ideas. The dynamic meditation proved particularly popular among this crowd, and a significant population of neo-sannyasins in the state grew. In 1974, Rajneesh moved from his Bombay apartment to 6 acres in a particularly wealthy district in Pune, a city in West India, where he established his first ashram, or monastery. At this point, he claimed that his health had decayed, but he still spoke twice a day to those people who would come. By the end of the 1970s, there were allegedly 600 permanent residents, with around 1,000 more in illegally erected huts. To manage the Rajneesh movement, multiple puppet companies were created, as well as numerous Swiss bank accounts. Interviews with visitors to the ashram tell of a chaotic feeling, with the horrific shouting of the dynamic meditation and confused Westerners in an emotionally vulnerable state. During dynamic meditation, participants were encouraged to act out their inner emotion, which often manifested as fighting. Bones were occasionally broken in altercations, and sexual violence was not unheard of. Venereal disease was also a concern due to the amount of casual sex being practiced on the property. By the end of the decade, the reputation of the ashram was decaying. Thousands of predominantly white Westerners had flocked to the city of Pune, seeking the guidance of Rajneesh. At this point, they outnumbered the Indians there by over 10 times, and they would often cause trouble. Staying at the ashram was expensive, and many took to smuggling drugs and selling them on Pune's streets to afford it. Others with more fragile psyches would end up in medical wards after attending classes and group sessions. These problems put a strain on the city, but the ashram hadn't been paying taxes since it had filed as a religious and educational facility. In light of these problems, and the ashram's growing value, the city revoked the ashram's claims of tax exemption and sued for back taxes equivalent to millions in American dollars, as well as forcing it to tear down the huts. Facing a new Indian regime unfavorable to him and the prospect of so much debt, Rajneesh would have to take drastic action. For some time, Rajneesh's main assistant, renamed Ma Yoga Lakshmi, had been hunting for a new space which Rajneesh sought to turn into a commune. However, despite months of searching, she faced blocker after blocker. While she had been gone, a woman named Ma Anand Sheela had played a political game to fill the administrative gap left behind, and once she had established herself, she suggested that they instead find somewhere in America for the commune. Under the pretense of necessary medical treatment, Rajneesh secretly traveled to America on May 31st, 1981, where he would stay by extending his tourist visa. After searching for nearly 3 months, Rajneesh and his administrative staff finally found a suitable plot of land, the Big Muddy Ranch in northeastern Oregon, which covered 64,000 acres or 100 square miles. The soil quality of the land was poor after overgrazing, but this was of little consequence to them. Immediately, the dutiful neo-sannyasins flew in and began their work. The first step was gaining bureaucratic authority, which is where their first issues began to manifest. Despite the degraded soil quality, Big Muddy Ranch had been zoned for farming, which meant that every single structure had to have some direct farming use, and every new structure needed direct approval from the state bureaucracy. This was a common gripe from the locals. However, the commune they had in mind was to be far more than a farm, and most of the buildings they wanted would immediately be vetoed by the Wasco County Oversight Council, were they to apply for them. In order to resist state oversight and construct their buildings unmolested, the neo-sannyasins decided to become an incorporated city, which meant that they could put together their own oversight council. Becoming an incorporated city was simple. All that was required was a population of 150 people. When they first arrived, they only had several dozen, but when this loophole was discovered, Ma Anand Sheela demanded that they use names and addresses from California to expedite the process. Swami Krishna Deva quotes her as saying, "You know I am not interested in waiting. Do it, and do it tomorrow." Before applying for incorporation, however, the group's private lawyers in Portland advised them that this move would attract the ire of an environmentalist group known as 1,000 Friends of Oregon. And so, Sheela decided that she would approach them first. She attempted to convince them that the neo-sannyasins were there to restore the land, but needed a city to perform this arduous work. While the lawyers of 1,000 Friends were receptive to her, they remained unconvinced about the need for a city. When this failed, she attempted bribery, but this only enraged her audience. She left in a huff, but not before insulting their legal practice. Under the tutelage of the experienced Rajneesh, Sheela began to use the commune's media attention to hurl insults at 1,000 Friends, claiming bigotry on their part, though this seemed only to increase their donation revenue when she began to appear on their printed media. Concerned about Sheela's tactics, another member of Rajneesh's leadership, Ma Yoga Vidya, approached Rajneesh to protest, but rather than listening to Vidya's counsel, Rajneesh chided her and demanded that nobody ever question Sheela's decisions again. Undaunted, the neo-sannyasins continued with their plan. But before they could apply for incorporation, they needed to construct housing for these workers, and to construct housing, they would need approval from Wasco County. During their meeting with the Wasco planners, the neo-sannyasins shrouded the true nature of the movement by eschewing their orange clothing in favor of less conspicuous outfits. They also went by their birth names, claiming that they were not religious in any way. They asked for enough building permits to house approximately 150 people. The plan worked. California neo-sannyasins began to make the trip up to northeastern Oregon, often being housed in tents before they could build their more permanent A-frame homes. These people were encouraged to sell all of their possessions and give their liquid assets to aid in the construction of the commune. In order to mask the number of people they were actually housing, the workers would hide some of their mattresses when the Wasco County planners came by to inspect them. They also managed to conceal the fact that the buildings deviated greatly from the permits they had been granted, leaving out most amenities in favor of simply being cheap housing. Along with this, they also crafted a landing strip for Rajneesh's small fleet of Learjets. It wasn't long before they had enough people for incorporation. When the time came, they already had a name chosen: Rajneeshpuram. Though the neo-sannyasins had already won their incorporation, the lawsuit led by 1,000 friends was still pending, and if they won, many of the planned structures in Rajneeshpuram would have to be torn down. And so, the Rajneeshi turned their attention 20 miles away to the town of Antelope. Antelope was incredibly small, consisting of approximately 40 people, mostly retired, but if the Rajneeshi wanted to securely build their desired administrative office and printing factory for Rajneesh's books, they would have to build it outside of Rajneeshpuram, and Antelope was the obvious choice. However, when they applied for the building permits, the city council denied them, citing the fact that the town didn't have the water supply for the 100 or so new people that would be working there. Enraged, the Rajneeshi began a brutal legal campaign to decide not only the fate of the buildings, but the fate of the little town of Antelope. Immediately after the denial for the permits, the Rajneeshi began a slew of lawsuits against Antelope. In order to shut down the aggression, the town made the tactical decision to hold a special election on April 15, 1982. The goal was to disincorporate the city, denying any further building. However, the Rajneeshi took advantage of the lax voting laws by having members stay overnight on the property they had bought, technically allowing them to vote. In the end, there were 42 votes for disincorporation, 55 against. The Rajneeshi had the legal right to build. However, this gained them a remarkable amount of bad press, as well as ill will from the Antelope community, which had, up to this point, been relatively welcoming. Sheila quickly shifted much of the focus of her insult-laced rhetoric against the town of Antelope. Over the course of 1982, Sheila also took control of management of the Rajneesh brand, and here, changes were to be radical. Up to this point, the money gathered from the franchised meditation and teaching centers had been considerable, but with the advent of Rajneeshpuram, she and her underlings demanded that the model of all franchises be changed. This included standardized logos, standardized food at restaurants, and standardized lessons, but the most drastic was that all small practices were to close immediately. They claimed that there were 575 around the world, but the Rajneesh movement had a history of exaggerating numbers. Instead of practice centers, they were to pour their funds into creating new communes, as well as sending the money directly to Rajneeshpuram, which was to be the new center for the Rajneesh movement. Unsurprisingly, most of the people running the meditation centers were unhappy about this order, as they were unwilling to give up their lives and their lucrative businesses, but the full damage of this order wouldn't be apparent for some time. Rajneeshpuram was also under pressure from another, much more unexpected source: Rajneesh himself. In India, he had developed a taste for fine goods and conspicuous consumption, which ran contrary to the minimalist lifestyle he espoused in Rajneeshpuram. He began making demands on Sheila. Not only did he want a beautiful, large new house, but he also wanted other luxuries. In particular, he had a taste for two things: jewel-encrusted watches and Rolls-Royce cars, and for these he had a seemingly insatiable appetite. Soon, news sources in Oregon were keeping track of his growing fleet. Rajneesh would ride down in one of his Rolls-Royces daily to show himself to his devout followers, but he refused to speak to them, as he had now taken on a vow of silence. Instead, people simply cheered as he passed by. These shows became the focus of media attention. He took to speeding down the barren highways of Central Oregon, often being stopped and ticketed, which he seemed to take with good humor. Meanwhile, the situation in Antelope was degrading. In November of 1982, the Rajneeshi were able to entirely clear out the native Antelope residents from the city council and fill it with people from the commune. To intimidate the residents, Rajneeshi would openly write down people's license plates and photograph them, as well as jeering at them in the streets. Sheila denounced the town in the Oregonian, stating that, quote, "Oregon can hardly prosper if it is to be filled with stagnant, dilapidated little towns like Antelope, a place where unproductive, indolent old people go to mark time until they die." This barrage of aggression eventually proved to be too much, and soon most of the original population had left. In short order, the town was renamed to Rajneesh, but this victory was bittersweet for the Rajneeshi. The following month, the Immigration and Naturalization Service had denied Rajneesh permanent resident status, pointing out the fact that he had requested residence claiming that he had failing health while also trying to register as a religious worker. The Rajneeshi had time to fight this decision, but this proved an imminent threat to Rajneesh's residence in America. At this point, the Rajneeshi had already begun constructing buildings to accommodate their bloating population. Perplexingly, much of the population of Rajneeshpuram consisted of highly educated college graduates, and in many cases, their specific talents were put to use. Lawyers helped both defend the commune and lash out at its opponents. Agriculturalists were employed to create a sustainable food source and rejuvenate the depleted land. Engineers helped design the layout of the city and the buildings, as well as solving issues of water and waste. Approximately a tenth of the population had psychology degrees. A person's qualifications, though, were not always utilized, but due to Rajneesh's teachings, menial and hard labor were viewed as enjoyable, even with over 12-hour workdays 7 days a week. These planners were able to skirt regulation by carefully writing requests for permits. Swami Krishna Deva, the appointed mayor of the town, later said that, quote, "When we applied, for instance, for a permit for a greenhouse, we applied for a permit for what might be the largest greenhouse ever, but it was built to the specifications and with the capacity to be a gathering hall for festivals and people coming. Everything that we applied for agricultural on the surface had a second underlying and false motive, if you will, to be a part of what would be the ultimate community for the disciples around the world." Soon, the commune was hosting thousands, a number helped along by a portent of doom given by Rajneesh that there would be a massive earthquake in California, something he had thought of after reading about Nostradamus. They would make money by hosting visitors and giving long group seminars, sometimes lasting months. Both the takeover of Antelope and their countercultural lifestyle attracted a significant amount of negative attention, as had Sheila's speeches on local news networks, but the leadership would soon find a way to use it to their advantage and exert their control over the population in a much more obvious way. Towards the end of 1982, Rajneeshpuram had begun putting together their own police force, which they dubbed the Peace Force, by sending some members to a police academy for training. Each of these trainees had graduated with high marks. Returning to the commune, they donned pink clothing and carried police pistols on their person. This was allegedly in response to threats of violence being made on the Rajneeshi, but surprisingly, it was not the commune itself that came under attack. On July 29, 1983, a man named Stephen Paul Pastor launched a bombing attack on Hotel Rajneesh in Portland, which also included the Rajneesh-owned Zorba the Buddha nightclub. However, while planting the explosives during the night, one of them prematurely detonated, severely injuring him. It was soon discovered that he was part of an extremist Islamic cult, but even so, it was used as propaganda by the leadership of Rajneeshpuram to show the Rajneeshi that outsiders were aggressive and hostile. Security checkpoints became standard procedure for visitors, as did police dogs and body searches.
Is anyone in mortal danger out here of coming?
Well, considering the number of threats that we receive over the phone and in the mail and in person every day, yes, I would say we are.
Stricter dress codes were instituted as well. All of this was occurring while the population was growing. Many American members of the commune were instructed to marry foreigners to allow them permanent residence within the United States borders. The city portion of Rajneeshpuram was growing as well, including restaurants, boutiques, and a hotel for the visitors, who paid heavily for the opportunity to study at the new center for the Rajneesh movement. It was part of an effort to help make Rajneeshpuram a net positive financial venture, but by this point the financial situation of the commune and the Rajneesh movement had begun to deteriorate. Sheila's organizational restructuring had drastically reduced both the income and the influx of new neo-sannyasins into the movement. While most of their bookkeeping remains private, financial gifts had dropped by approximately 75% in the 2 years since Rajneesh had arrived in Oregon, and now that many of the remaining neo-sannyasins had moved to the communes due to Rajneesh's portents of doom, the influx of new followers had diminished considerably, even as the communes were growing. The meditation centers had offered an easy introduction to Rajneesh's methods, but now, interested parties would have to make their way to one of the communes to receive his teachings, greatly increasing the barrier to entry. The gold they had been smuggling from India was nowhere near enough to make up for this. What's more, the takeover of Antelope had earned Rajneeshpuram political enemies. Now, not only was the case from 1,000 Friends proceeding well, but a new issue had arisen. In July of 1983, the Oregon Land Conservation and Development Commission made a new rule that cities could no longer be incorporated without their direct approval. This rule was retroactive to just before the neo-sannyasins had sought to create their city, a move clearly targeting Rajneeshpuram and threatening to force its denizens to demolish nearly everything that they had created on the ranch land. Regular inspections were being performed, and permits had nearly been frozen. Paranoia had come to characterize the leadership of Rajneeshpuram, with an armed security force following Rajneesh whenever he left his home. As concerns grew, Sheila's leadership council attempted to strengthen the cohesiveness of the group by altering the Rajneeshi's practices. They began to emulate the rituals of other religions, including kneeling in the direction of Rajneesh's villa and chanting words in Sanskrit. Those who objected would be ordered to either change their opinions or leave, but leaving often wasn't a viable option due to the fact that many people had sold all of their possessions before going to live in the commune. The teachings of Rajneesh had attracted a docile populace, but even so, Sheila demanded a show of force to keep them in line and working their long hours. In spring of 1984, members of the commune traveled and gathered a collection of assault rifles, carbines, and pistols, though they had been stopped by federal authorities when attempting to procure fully automatic weapons. A new team of 150 people was trained to utilize both the weapons and the squadron of scout helicopters they had acquired. This sort of control, however, extended farther than many Rajneeshi knew, and the leadership's methods routinely invaded people's bodily autonomy. In multiple cases, when people expressed a desire to leave the commune, Sheila would have them tranquilized and sedated for a range of time lasting between a few days and 2 weeks until they agreed to stay. These people would then be forced to sneak out secretly at a later date. Another woman by the name of Samya attempted to send a letter to Rajneesh to complain about Sheila, but this letter was intercepted by her. Infuriated, Sheila ordered Samya's uterus removed. Other problematic people were falsely told that they had contracted AIDS and were quarantined away from the rest of the population, kept sick by one of the leaders who had training as a nurse, Ma Anand Puja, a close friend to Sheila. Those people who grew ill were not allowed to see medical specialists outside of the commune, and they were forced either to work through their illnesses or leave. However, Sheila's leadership position was being challenged by an unexpected source. Seeking more funds, a small group known as the Hollywood people were allowed to join the commune in early 1984, but not required to work the same way that the others were. Instead, they had their own housing, separate from the others, adorned with their own luxurious amenities, keeping away from the others in the commune. In return, they showered Rajneesh with even more Rolls Royces and fine watches. Sheila, however, had grown wary. She opened a broad campaign of wiretapping, overseen by her most trusted subordinates, specifically bugging the houses of the Hollywood people, the hotels, the payphones, and Rajneesh's house. This paranoia was fueled in part by the combination of stimulants and sedatives given to her by Ma Anand Puja, which were needed to continue her long days and frantic work. Rajneesh himself was on his own regime of powerful depressants, especially Valium, in order to help him sleep. With the minds of the two most powerful people in Rajneeshpuram addled by psychoactive drugs, the condition of the commune began to degrade even further, and their tactics grew even more wild. Hidden away in a corner of Rajneeshpuram, Sheila had set up a hidden laboratory with Puja, where the latter began to conduct research attempting to find biological weapons that would be difficult to trace back to the commune. Eventually, they settled on the bacterium Salmonella, a common cause of food poisoning, and Puja set to work incubating cultures for use. Before they could enact any of their plans, they decided that they needed to test their choice of bacterium. One day, in the summer of 1984, while 3 Wasco County commissioners were inspecting new construction on Rajneeshpuram during a routine visit, their car was sabotaged by the Rajneeshi. While they were waiting for repairs, Puja offered them glasses of water, each secretly contaminated with salmonella, and they accepted them. The next day, one of the commissioners was hospitalized, and according to the doctors, he would have died had he not received emergency care. One other man was bedridden for 2 days with similar symptoms. However, nothing incriminating the Rajneeshi could be found except for circumstantial evidence, and so they evaded litigation, if not suspicion. Around the same time, a small group of trusted Rajneeshi were making trips to the Dalles, a nearby town in Wasco County, to conduct further tests and attempt to sicken county workers by smearing the salmonella on public toilets in the courthouse, but to no avail. They then attempted to sicken people at rallies, but this too failed. Eventually, they hit on the idea of pouring the salmonella on vegetables in grocery stores, and they did so in a run led by Sheila herself. However, if people did grow sick from this attack, there were no news reports to the effect, rendering the test a failure. Time was running out for Sheila. Rajneesh was growing impatient, and he demanded that Sheila sweep away those legislators who were attempting to prevent the creation of his commune, and so she began to grow desperate. The election for Wasco County was coming in early November of 1984, and so she set up a threefold plan to take over the role of commissioner. The plan was similar to how they had overtaken Antelope, but on a much larger scale.
I tell you, the county is so f***ing bigoted, it deserves to be taken over.
One person, known to the neo-sannyasins as Ma Anand Jagruti, would run for commissioner by hiding her ties to Rajneeshpuram under her given name, Bonnie Barlow, and the Rajneeshi would conspire to help her win. The first part of this plan was fairly simple. She would contact other candidates in an attempt to get them to denounce Rajneeshpuram in some way, and then use those calls as leverage to claim bigotry on their part and damage their campaigns. But the other two elements of the plan were more complicated. The second part was an attempt to grow their own voter base. That fall, they opened a new initiative which they called the Share a Home program. The initiative, they claimed, was an effort to help house the homeless and share all that they had built with them. Rajneeshi buses went all around the country to gather homeless people, promising them food, beer, and lodging if they joined the commune, and if they didn't like it, they would be given a ticket back to their home cities. Their aim, however, wasn't charity. The plan was to have these homeless people vote for Ma Anand Jagruti in November, but this wouldn't be enough on its own. The third part was far more aggressive. In an effort to suppress the voter turnouts of the population in the Dalles, the Rajneeshi would use Puja's salmonella to sicken voters and prevent their turnout on election day. But as of yet, they had failed to make any real impact in any of their tests. And so, Sheila took a group of her trustees in mid-September to the Dalles one last time with live salmonella cultures, where they drove around to 10 different restaurants. They meticulously went to the salad bars, pouring the salmonella onto the salads and in the dressing. The effect was immediate and pronounced. The next day, people were being delivered to emergency rooms and doctors' offices under the effects of the bacterium. In the end, 751 people were infected, with 45 of them hospitalized. One pregnant woman nearly lost her child to the salmonella during labor. But miraculously, not one person died from the attack. Around the same time, they also attempted to poison the water system by dumping raw sewage into the public water tanks, but little apparently came of this. While officials claimed that this outbreak was one large coincidence, Oregonians strongly and correctly suspected the involvement of Rajneeshpuram. Every phase of the Rajneeshi's plan backfired tremendously. The woman they had chosen as their write-in candidate had been discovered engaging in voter fraud, trying to vote under both her given name and Rajneeshi name, and so neither her candidacy nor the phone calls she had gathered could be used. Rather than halt the voters, the attack on the Dalles spurred thousands more people in Wasco County to register to vote in order to fight the Rajneeshi. But by far, the worst failure was the Share a Home program. The number of people that the Rajneeshi needed to sway the election was high, even assuming that the other elements of the plan succeeded, and quickly, the homeless population that the Rajneeshi had brought to live in the commune vastly outnumbered the previous resident population. However, the program had been indiscriminate in its collection of homeless, and soon, fights were breaking out between them. To control them, their beer was laced with haloperidol, a powerful antipsychotic. What's more, a majority of the people brought in requested to leave, but only a few of them were given the tickets that they were promised, since buying that many tickets would have been prohibitively expensive. Instead, the Rajneeshi simply abandoned them in towns around Oregon. When the election finally came, many of the votes from Rajneeshpuram were turned down after special hearings discovered widespread voter fraud from the commune. The Rajneeshi were often attempting to register twice or register dead people to vote. The election was a massive failure. Attempting to leverage their position, Sheila arranged to covertly meet with the staff of Oregon's governor, where she offered a deal. The Rajneeshi would help return the homeless to where they came from in return for complete freedom to build whatever they wished in Rajneeshpuram, as well as a drop of the cases against the city's incorporation and Rajneesh's residency. Unsurprisingly, these demands were denied. Around this time, other lawsuits were pending based on numerous things, especially Sheila's inflammatory behavior, including one case where she had insulted a woman, saying her husband had not died in a hunting accident, but instead committed suicide because she had cheated on him. These suits often would favor the plaintiffs, losing Rajneeshpuram millions. As 1985 came, it was looking more and more like the Rajneeshi would be expelled from Oregon entirely and their leader ejected from the country as their finances dwindled. But Sheila was willing to make one final series of efforts to secure Rajneeshpuram's future. Her first plan was to burn down the offices of Dan Duro, the Wasco County planner. They created makeshift torches by soaking cardboard in lighter fluid and using candles as fuses, but these devices mostly failed and not much was actually destroyed, only taking the offices approximately 2 weeks to repair. Later, at a trial about Rajneeshpuram's improper electrical wiring for a festival, she had the drinking water poisoned with high amounts of haloperidol. Despite the crippling symptoms displayed by those who drank it, this move also failed, and the commune lost the case. In Australia, Sheila earned partial ownership of a company, but when she was accused of drugging shareholders to acquire it, the stock tanked. A former Rajneeshi was on the brink of winning a $1.7 million lawsuit, and so Sheila sent a team to assassinate her with poison at her hotel, disguised in plain clothing and wigs. They failed after they couldn't find any time when she was alone. One day, when a city councilman from the Dalles was recovering from ear surgery, Pooja went to the hospital with potassium and adrenaline, which she would administer through his IV drip to stop his heart and kill him. However, when Pooja entered his room and discovered that he didn't have an IV drip, she panicked and left. When she and her compatriots attempted to leave, they discovered that their car had a dead battery. Sheila also arranged to have the man investigating the sham marriages at the commune killed by use of untraceable handguns, but also failed when, again, the team couldn't find an opportune time. But Sheila's list of assassination targets didn't only contain those from without. In a special meeting, Sheila read a transcript, allegedly from a tape recorded on one of her wiretaps. Apparently, Rajneesh had been considering suicide, and his caretaker, Devaraj, was explaining how he could help him accomplish this through a series of lethal injections. She demanded Devaraj, as well as Rajneesh's personal doctor, Vivek, assassinated as conspirators. Other members of the leadership suspected that it was not only for this reason, but because Sheila had grown jealous of the attention they received from Rajneesh. In fact, Rajneesh had warned the others that anyone who grew too close to him became a target for Sheila. The method of assassination would be a lethal dose of adrenaline delivered by syringe. The first target, Vivek, was to be killed in mid-June in her house by knocking her unconscious with an ether-soaked rag before being injected. This attempt failed when the key to the door wouldn't work. In fact, the two would-be assassins, Avalos and Sue, grew sick from inhaling the ether. The following day, the attempt on Devaraj almost succeeded. During a festival, Devaraj was injected with the syringe of adrenaline, but the attempt inevitably failed when he recognized what had happened and sought treatment at a hospital. While this was happening, the Leadership Council was also making plans to load one of their planes with explosives and fly it into the Wasco County Planning Office. But by this point, the leadership was collapsing under the moral strain of attempted murder, and the rest of the leadership refused to participate in any more of Sheila's assassination plans. Due to the uncanny series of failures, the total number of people actually killed was 0. What's more, the commune was hemorrhaging members. New York Times reporter Frances Fitzgerald wrote that, quote, "At the end of August, when I visited the ranch once again, Rajneeshpuram looked empty and motionless by comparison with the way it had been in 1983. The atmosphere in this half-ghost town was decidedly spooky." Unquote. The legal deadlock had halted any more building besides a few small structures, and the series of lost legal disputes had drained the commune's finances, as had Rajneesh's obsessive demand for more Rolls-Royces. By this point, his fleet had expanded to include 93 of them. Both Rajneesh and Sheila could see that the commune was about to collapse, but there was also a more immediate threat to each of them, something that had been building for years. In mid-September, anticipating trouble, Sheila booked a flight to Europe with a small cadre of her leadership council. Rajneesh spoke publicly, denouncing Sheila's actions as fascist and lifting many of the restrictive policies that she had enacted in Rajneeshpuram, while claiming that she had run off with much of his money.
She has no dignity. All dignity that she thinks she has was given by me. She was just a hotel waitress, and I made her almost a queen.
He also claimed that he had only learned of all of Sheila's most aggressive actions after she had left and others had informed him. This last claim, however, was unlikely after it was learned that Rajneesh had ousted his previous leadership council and replaced them with the Hollywood group, who were more willing to give him what he wanted. It didn't take long to learn why Sheila had fled so quickly, however. On October 23, 1985, a grand jury decided to indict Rajneesh and Sheila, as well as some of the leadership council, with evidence of evading immigration laws. This case had been building for some time, and the Rajneeshi legal team had been monitoring it, but there was little they could do to halt it. In fact, much of the leadership had agreed to testify in return for lighter sentences. However, before the indictment could be delivered, it was leaked to Rajneesh, who immediately chartered 2 of his Learjets out of Rajneeshpuram with an eventual destination in Bermuda. With him, he took a gun, 6 of his disciples, and a box with dozens of bejeweled wristbands and watches. He would have to make a few stops, and he was unaware that he was being monitored by the federal government in case he attempted to flee. He was caught in Charlotte, North Carolina, and jailed. Only a day later, Sheila was discovered in Germany and extradited to America. As the leadership spoke, the truth of the commune and their actions became more apparent, and the membership of Rajneeshpuram rapidly dwindled. With even more lawsuits opening as the Salmonella attack on the Dalles came to light, the ranch's insurance company foreclosed on the property. Sheila was swiftly given 20 years in prison, but she was let out on parole after only 2 years for good behavior. Sometime after her release, she remarried to another neo-sannyasin and moved to Switzerland, where she bought 2 nursing homes. Rajneesh himself was deported back to India, where he renamed himself Osho in an attempt to distance himself from the commune, but he died only 5 years later. Today, the site that was once Rajneeshpuram is now a Christian youth camp. The Rajneesh movement now generally attempts to tie itself to the rechristened Osho, with meditation centers slowly gaining popularity again, while the ashram in Pune continues to attract followers. Rajneeshpuram now serves as a lesson in how much a group of people with a common ideal can attain, but it also serves as a warning about how idealism can be manipulated by the will of just a few people.